Right. Let's go ahead and get started. And I'll have the chat open. Welcome and thank you for starting to use the chat to introduce yourself. Welcome everyone to the Othered UX Career Map for women, people of color, and queer creatives. I'm really excited that you're going to be able to join us today. I love that you're going to use the chat to keep networking and talking. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this session is about. My name is Samaya. I'm the founder at UX Woman. I have about 9 years of expertise across startups, consulting, and corporate, specializing in inclusive design for brands like Disney, Hulu, and Marvel. And I wanted to quickly go over some of the contents that we're going to be covering today. So we're going to talk about some introductions and ground rules. We're going to talk about some mindsets for other creatives, especially in this environment and the tech world today. And then we're going to talk about what is inclusive design thinking even in the first place? How do we start to apply that into our own design processes as othered creatives? We're going to talk about the laws of UX, get a 10-minute MBA on how design and business intersect, and then we're going to dive into creative career paths. So a little bit of background on me. I studied mechanical engineering at Carnegie Mellon before pivoting into product design and UX design. So these past 9 years, I've worked at startups, agencies, and corporate in UI UX design. You might have also heard of Ideate Labs. I co-founded Ideate Labs and ran that business for about 4 years. I've mentored folks at UPenn's Wharton's Venture Lab, especially, entrepreneurs and up and coming entrepreneurs. And currently, I'm the founder of UX Woman. And I wanted to just put some ground rules aside before we get started. So I'd love for you to put yourself on mute and unmute only if you would like to share something or ask a question. Really make use of the chat. We will constantly be checking in for updates and contributions to the chat. And the most important thing of all is to just be kind and open-minded and always build on each idea. We're really trying to create a psychologically safe environment where both good and bad ideas can be shared openly and freely. This is a no judgment zone. And please feel free to ask us questions, even if you're like, well, I don't know if I should ask this question. Go ahead and ask it. I'm a big nerd, so I nerd out on all things UX design. And I really just want to hear your questions and thoughts on UX, the state of UX today, and the design thinking process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with some mindsets for othered creatives. And I just kind of wanted to dive in with some facts to begin with, especially around workforce diversity and pay. So did you know that right now women make up about 35% of the tech force? And back in the 2000s, we actually only made up about 9% of the tech force. And it's clear we've had to fight our way into tech companies, boardrooms, that didn't really just want us there. And we can do even better. So my question to you is, how do we try as women, people of color, queer creatives, how do we get that number up to 50% in 2050? What do we need to do as women today to support the next generation and to go ahead and pursue their dreams? How do we start to pay it forward? So that was part of the reason why I created UX Woman in the first place, is to stop the gatekeeping within UX and the tech world, and to really make sure education was as accessible as possible, both free and paid resources. When we look at statistics on members of the LGBTQ community, it's estimated that up to 2 to 3% of folks from the LGBTQ community make up the tech workforce. And I'm guessing that that is an underreported number, because I'm not sure how many of us feel comfortable expressing to companies in this environment and in this stage of the world that we live in about our identity and our expressions. So again, take this data with a grain of salt, but this is kind of to give you a sense of what's happening currently and what's going on. And, we haven't even started to consider the challenges that other creatives face based on their gender, their orientation, their socioeconomic status, their age, their education, and so much more. And, one example of this is that women of color, and this is, I'm sure, not a surprise to a lot of you on this call, earn significantly less in comparison to other working groups. So there's a lot to consider from an intersectional perspective. And so we have to kind of get back to what does that mean for inclusive UX education, right? We have to try to take on an intersectional approach when helping members of our community, really taking the time to understand their career journey, their unique challenges and mindsets and constraints. And this is why we have never advocated for a one-size-fits-all approach to UX education. So UX education for women, people of color, and career creatives really requires a really personalized approach because of each of our unique personal challenges that each student potentially faces. And so we have to start to think of, okay, what are some mindsets we can put together to kind of still succeed in today's really tough environments? So I really truly believe that what makes us unique and vulnerable is our source of strength, wisdom, and power. It's not a weakness, and we need to lean into our unique approaches within the design process. And I really believe that the design process requires a reinvention today. What we're going to do is talk about a brief history of design thinking as we move on into this presentation. And you're going to find that design thinking has been around since like the 1960s, but not much has changed. So what can we do as other creatives to really reinvent the design process to be more inclusive of our communities and our ideas? And I will, talk through the difference between design thinking and inclusive design as we go on in this talk. But really, what we need to do is collectively educate and sell investors and key business stakeholders on a more inclusive design process at work, while considering their fears and priorities, which is usually around money, the bottom line, profits. And ultimately, we need to show folks that inclusive design is simply good business, and we'll share case studies on this as we go. So we really need to lean into our passions, our industry expertise, and our own unique visions to manifest the UX career we want, but also paying it forward to future generations as well. And I wanted to talk about some of the UX women community members who have really gone on to focus on innovation. So one example is Andrea. She took our 7-month UX design MBA program, and she was really inspired by her daughter to create a non-binary e-commerce thrift store experience. And her innovative idea really pushes the boundaries of what traditional e-commerce fashion is today, and it reconsiders fit and sizing from a gender neutral perspective. And I think that's really exciting and something that, not everyone in the mainstream markets would think about, but it's really the other creatives who really take the time to understand that there's more than one perspective, that there's ways that we can do things that are better than the mainstream way of doing things. And that really is what leads to innovation. And they've also, our mentees have also gone on to build successful AI products. So one example was Ashley. She's a business owner for a beauty salon, and she went through our program and learned the end-to-end design process. And she worked to scope an AI scheduler and product recommender for beauty salon business owners to really maintain better customer relationships. So Ashley knew, dozens of beauty salon owners, and she realized that the biggest pain point was really scheduling appointments and cancellations. And that wasted a lot of admin time for salon owners who preferred to just, do the more creative sides of their business. So what the scheduler did was it would schedule beauty appointments, handle cancellations and reschedules, recommend products post-appointment as upsells, and increase the return on investment for a salon owner with more efficiently booked schedules so that they could really more effectively and efficiently run their business while increasing their profits. Our mentees have also gone on to balance entrepreneurship and corporate work. So Alia landed a UX research role at Reddit, despite, the layoffs and the current tech climate. And the great thing about Alia is that she really loves being an entrepreneur. So prior to joining us, Alia had actually launched 2 startups, and they had failed. And we talk about, my history as well in this big YouTube video where I've launched startups that have failed as well. And she talks about, what the creative process is like and how she juggles both creating a side hustle, launching a new startup, while also being a UX researcher at Reddit, because she has that entrepreneurial spirit and she doesn't want to place herself inside a box. And so, her approach was really to land a corporate job for financial security and to grow as a UX researcher. But she also wanted to apply her skill sets from our mentorship towards building a side hustle or startup and creating her own product and experimenting constantly. Our mentees have also gone to rebrand to more senior level UX researcher roles and design roles. So one example is Kristen, who rebranded to a senior product designer role after being a graphic designer and art director for over 5 years. And she was able to attract new opportunities and really showcase more of the strategy side of what she learned within our program and mentorship. Same thing with Jennifer. Jennifer really leveraged her background as a therapist for over 10 years and landed a UX researcher role after going through some of our mentorship and one-on-one education. So with that, I'm going to start to dive into what is inclusive design thinking in the first place. A lot of you have heard about design thinking and the design process. So we're going to build on that definition. So just to begin with, design thinking is a nonlinear, iterative process that teams use to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine problems, and create innovative solutions to prototype and test. That's a pretty lengthy, wordy definition from the Interaction Design Foundation. But if we simplify that, it's really just the process of collaborating to define problems and then find innovative solutions. And this is a visual from Nielsen Norman Group where the design thinking process can be split up into 6 different steps. We're empathizing with users to understand their needs. We're defining our scope of our project and research with stakeholders and users alike. We're ideating based on, the research that we've done. We prototype some ideas, we start to test them, consolidate them, and finally implement one MVP or minimum viable product or one feature. And this design thinking process could be anywhere between 2 weeks long to 2 months long to maybe even 2 years long as well. It really just depends. And it's just constant iteration. It's cyclical. But we also need to kind of take a step back and really think about how was design thinking as a term coined, right? So the term design thinking really came into popularity in the 90s when IDEO sold this idea of the design process to solve business problems. And this led to IDEO as a consulting firm really gaining prestige in the business world and really gaining that credibility to to apply design thinking and be the creatives for business-minded corporations and business stakeholders. But we also have to kind of keep in mind that design thinking is quickly becoming outdated and not solving all our problems. And we're seeing this with the rise of AI in our industry currently, and how there's a push from the CEOs and leadership to just make everything more efficient, to just keep using AI to make teams leaner, right? But at the same time, they're losing out on the empathy, which is so crucial to the design thinking process. And just by prioritizing efficiency doesn't mean that they're going to be successful companies. In fact, they might fail as a company, and we're going to talk about that in the design MBA portion. So there have been more recent critique in the past few years about design thinking and how it essentially can lead to gatekeeping in the industry. So it's really only design experts who can really apply design thinking, when in reality, all of us are creative to an extent. All of us can and should own the creative process, right? Design thinking belongs to all of us. It doesn't just belong to a fancy corporate or consulting company like IDEO. And it's also the design process came about to sell, right? Design thinking is a sales tactic. It was used by consulting agencies to sell the creative process to corporations and business-minded stakeholders. But it also leads to a few people being the gatekeepers, a few people holding that credibility of being the creative, and that leads to less diversity in design. Back when I started in design about 10 years ago, in my very first UX design role, I was the only person of color in my design team of about 30 individuals at a consulting firm. So that just shows you kind of what things were like, and things have improved gradually, but things could always be better, right? We can always be improving our processes. So there's also often, because of that like lack of diversity, a lot of our mainstream products and services don't really cater to marginalized group, don't even solve problems that folks from marginalized communities feel. And this means that our perspectives go unrecognized, unseen, and unheard a lot of the time. So by practicing inclusive design, it can be a great way to enhance the traditional design thinking process. And it's really up to us as the othered creatives to now create that new sales pitch together, right? Design thinking and the design process has always been a sales pitch used by consulting agencies and design directors to sell design projects. So how do we come up with a new way to sell? That, we have to kind of pause there and think about, okay, what is inclusive design in the first place, and how did it come about, and how did it even evolve? So there's lots of different definitions, actually. So DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, is, something that tends to focus on creating work cultures with diversity, equity, and inclusion in mind. However, and this is my own personal point of view, it also leads to a lot of PR stunts at agencies and companies most of the time. And I'm not sure how much data there is out in the corporate world to actually prove that companies are taking action on DEI, right? And we're seeing how, depending on who's in power, depending on who has leverage, DEI is either super popular or it's completely unheard of. And, a lot of companies are cutting budgets on DEI. So to me, in my opinion, DEI hasn't created any lasting impact. It has certainly moved the needle. It's certainly improved conditions for othered creatives, but there's a lot more we can be doing. Then comes value sensitive design. So value sensitive design was a term that, was coined in the 90s to advocate for ethical design based on the team's values. However, those values were left up to interpretation and remained vague, right? Every company, every team had a different set of values. So the value sensitive design was only as good as the team's values. And there was no standard on what's the value system being used. If you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend reading the book Design Justice. So I'll share a link to that later on. Universal design was also then coined by disability advocates and activists, and that strives for accessible designs for the broadest set of users. So one example of this is IKEA's furniture instructions, right? They're made super simple for everyone so that, no one is required to read or understand any language in particular. They have really simplified their manuals to visuals that, are very simple to understand and interpret. And that allows them, it's good for business because it allows them to mass produce their instruction manuals without considering language and readability. And it kind of simplifies the process for everyone involved, all types of users. However, of course, we have to keep in mind that this doesn't work for all users, but it does make the instruction manuals really accessible across languages, cultures, countries where IKEA furniture is distributed. So the idea around universal design was to always design for, the broadest set of users and really consider, the simplest use case and the simple, like the most need, or the most support needs, I would say, when designing anything so that it would have the broadest access across all users. And then that starts to lead us into inclusive design. So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach like universal design, inclusive design really advocates for a one-size-fits-one approach, or radical personalization of products. And I think a really great example of this is Spotify's Wrapped experience during the end of each year. So at the end of each year, everybody gets a Wrapped experience that is very hyper-specific to their music tastes and preferences, how much they listened to certain genres or certain artists. And that personalization actually leads to better engagement and content discovery for Spotify. So that, I would say, is kind of a great modern day example of inclusive design and hyper personalization. And that is what I think all of us should be striving to achieve in the age of UX and digital products, especially with AI on the rise, we can actually leverage AI to create more personalized algorithms. So, thinking about Netflix's algorithm or Spotify's algorithm comes to mind with that hyper-personalized approach to content recommendations. And then finally, we can take it one step further with design justice. And design justice takes inclusive design and universal design principles one step further and advocates for righting historical wrongs through design practices. So, for example, an inclusive design approach to college admissions might be to make sure that, accepted students represent the population. So, based on race, gender, income level, and other factors, everyone is represented according to the demographics data. But design justice might strive to overrepresent historically marginalized communities to right the wrongs of the past and admit a larger percent of marginalized populations beyond the percentage that they represent currently. So those are just the definitions to kind of get a sense of what each of these are. And I see a question. Would you say in psychology that there are best practices that cover a wide range of users, while there are ways to make designs more inclusive and personalized with AI and other practices? That's a really great question, Tatiana. We'll talk about trauma-informed research in particular, which is an up-and-coming practice in the research world to really take on a more inclusive approach to how we conduct our research. And if you're interested, I would really recommend checking out Chain, and I'll write their name here. Chain is an agency that supports, folks who've gone through domestic violence, or sexual assault and abuse. And they do a lot of UX research, and they have also cataloged their trauma-informed research approach and how they provide care and support to their research participants before, during, and after a study. And they go into a lot of detail on it, so I would highly recommend reading some of their blogs. But that's a really great question. So really, when we think about universal design, inclusive design, value-sensitive design, it depends on the degree to which you're designing and what team you're on. Really, what we really need to focus on is co-creation as being a key aspect of inclusive design. So it's really important to co-create with marginalized audiences, and it's important to have those audiences be represented within the design team. And there's, a slogan that comes up from inclusive design that says, "Nothing about us without us." So design teams, especially homogenous design teams, should not be designing for the othered folks, the othered, right? We need othered creatives in those teams to co-create. And it's not only just about representation on the team, it's also about co-creating actively with users throughout the design process. So again, this takes away the power, which is a little scary, right? And the gatekeeping. And a lot of times in these sales pitches that, prestigious firms like IDEO did, they consolidate the power, they consolidate the gatekeeping. The same thing happens in corporate teams, funnily enough, right? As the design team, we consolidate. We are the gatekeepers of design. We're the gatekeepers of creatives. And that kind of helps us keep, job security. But really, if we want to practice inclusive design, we need to make creativity and design accessible throughout an organization. And that was part of my job at Disney to, recognize that we were the experts in design and research, but also provide accessible education throughout the organization so that everyone was empowered to be creative and also involve us in their creative process, right? And co-creation is the best way to distribute that power, because now it's all about it's not about the power play and the power dynamics at work. It's about co-creating and really coming up with the most thoughtful, intentional solution based on a negotiating between different stakeholders and between different types of users. So when we consider inclusive design lenses, we have to ensure that we're considering a wide variety of groups, but we can't just, use demographic information. We can't just say, okay, we need to recruit 50% female, 50% male, maybe 20% non-binary folks to a study or something like that. We have to consider an intersectional approach depending on the study that we're trying to set up and the topic that we're trying to address. But we need to consider a variety of lenses. And those lenses include gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, income and social class, educational level, support needs, age, and culture. So again, this is hyper-specific to each UX research project or study, and we have to really be sure to take on an intersectional approach rather than just, considering one lens or one element. And it's very easy to start to stereotype when we only consider one lens or one element, like just race or just gender. So you saw when we talked about wage gaps that, women of color are paid significantly less than their counterparts. And that reflects the variety of lenses that we see the world through and the variety of lenses through which bias exists today. So again, how might we consider inclusive design when choosing a project topic? So this is something I ask my students within our 7-month design MBA program. And I ask them, when have you had a negative emotional experience and turned it into something positive? What industries or experiences have gaps that result in negative experiences for you or a community that you're aware of or you're a part of? What supply and demand sectors can be reinvented for a better experience? And our students have really gone on to take on really exciting and niche ideas that are very beyond the mainstream. So one example was Andrea with her idea for a non-binary e-commerce fashion platform. We've had students and folks choose to focus on polyamorous dating as their topic, or education for the kink and BDSM community and folks who wanted to learn about kink and BDSM. We've had folks who've, chosen to focus on topics like managing grief, postpartum depression, sex education for teenage boys. And these are all ideas that are kind of ignored by the mainstream. These are gaps that women in our community are noticing. And inclusive design just happens to be really good for business as well. And a case in point is Fenty Beauty. So Fenty's vision was beauty for all, and they started to consider 40 foundation shades at launch and now 50, considering more nuances in skin tone, unlike a lot of other brands. So before Fenty Beauty arrived on the scene, most mainstream foundation brands only provided 20 to 30 different shades of foundation. And that excluded a lot of makeup users and consumers, right? There were folks who had really light skin tones that were excluded by the mainstream market, folks who had darker skin tones who were excluded by the mainstream market. I also face this challenge because there's actually only one skin tone from one particular brand that I can get at CVS and Rite Aid that works for me. And every other tone is either too orange or too brown, and I end up looking really weird. And I have to buy out this one shade because sometimes it's really severely understocked because it's not one of the mainstream shades. So that kind of shows you the need and kind of the urgency of this issue. And Fenty Beauty went live in 17 countries at the time that they launched, and then they were operationally ready to ship their product to over 137 countries, very close to when they started, operating the business. And so, the marketing team for Fenty was diverse. It followed Rihanna's vision and showcased stories of women around the world using product. And so, that I think that's a really inspiring story. Not only is Fenty a great success story, but it's also worth $2.8 billion. And, this is not luck. This is because of blue ocean strategy and inclusive design. And Rihanna noticed the need for an underserved community that was just being unaddressed by the mainstream markets. And she was able to create a solution that really helped provide a solution for an urgent problem that these communities had. And that resulted in a $2.8 billion brand. And, we could argue that, yes, Rihanna is a celebrity, she had all these resources behind her. But if we look at brands created by other celebrities like J-Lo or Selena Gomez, they are not $2.8 billion brands. So it's really the strategy that led to those billions of dollars. And this just shows you It's very clear to me, and hopefully to you as well, that inclusive design just means it's good for business. Another really great case study on inclusive design is Netflix and their storytelling. So during the 2009 recession, Netflix was the OG streamer in the US, and they focused on American content and the American market. And then the recession brought a need for the Netflix to grow and scale despite really trying economic times. So Netflix launched a plan during the recession to scale globally and succeeded in scaling to 50 countries by 2015 and 190 countries by 2017. So how did they do that? They first focused on countries that had similarities to the US market. So Canada, UK, Australia, these are English-speaking countries. They are culturally similar countries, and it was easier to scale their production to those markets. But what they really did well was they co-created, right? They really took on an inclusive design approach. They worked closely with local creatives and producers to create content that was true to the local markets that they were entering, and they deferred to local creatives to set the stage for storyline, character, plot, and culture. And this is really, really innovative because a lot of working in entertainment, I know this, a lot of entertainment brands, especially the ones who are not doing as well as Netflix, don't do this, right? They just try to push their culture and their content onto other countries. And they might just create translations for English-speaking content or Hollywood content, but they don't go above and beyond to create local, culturally relevant content for those local audiences. And that was a huge innovation, which is what led to Netflix growing and scaling and so successfully like they did. So based on those initial learnings, right, they started to expand to more countries and more locations. Now they had to consider more nuances. So considering, say, Spanish-speaking countries and populations, there was more nuance to consider there, more cultural nuances to understand across different Spanish-speaking cultures and countries. And Netflix still took the time to create hyper-localized content. If you look at Netflix content today, there's Money Heist, which is set in Spain, but they also create content that are very relevant to countries like Peru, Chile, Mexico, right? And you can find that hyper-specific content. You can hear in the content, the way the content is produced, that there's different dialects of Spanish, different types of Spanish that they're considering. I'm not an expert in the Spanish language, so that's all I can say for now, but they really took that effort to create really hyper-localized content. And so, by the way, it pays off to be inclusive in designing because Netflix is the leading streamer globally. They surpassed Amazon Prime, no surprise, and Disney because of their localized co-creative processes. So while Amazon Prime was the first to enter the Indian market, for example, Netflix took over and surpassed Amazon's success because of their inclusive design innovation. Amazon, like I mentioned, was pushing American content, US-based content, English-based content to foreign audiences. And I can speak as someone who comes from India. We don't like Hollywood being pushed onto us. We have Bollywood. We have our own culture. We don't need an outsider culture coming in and kind of dictating what the cultural trends should be, right? So we wanted to lean into our own cultures, and Netflix was willing to work with that. And they really created hyper specialized content, really resonating with local audiences. But what did Netflix do really well after that? They also enabled access to that global content everywhere, right? So as an American consumer, I have access to Money Heist from Spain and Squid Games from South Korea, and Lupin from France. And I think that's really exciting. And it shows that we really are hungry for that kind of content and hungry for that type of knowledge and understanding of the world. So it also kind of leads me back to innovation during trying times. Sometimes our most innovative ideas come from times that are, economic recessions, trying times, hard times. And as other creatives, as communities of women, people of color, and queer creatives, we have long been overlooked and passed up for pay raises and promotions. Our stories and point of views have very often been dismissed, which leads us to feel unseen, unheard, invisible. And we've all had those share of hard times, regardless of, the lenses that, we or our unique identities. And I think this is what makes us as a community really resilient. And, our creativity has really been tried and tested, and our grit keeps us moving and pushing forward. So we need to pick up on those trends and patterns that are often overlooked by the mainstream, which leads us to create really unique projects and innovative ideas. So as I had mentioned, our UX women cohorts have really come up with some incredible ideas like finance apps for senior citizens, therapy for caregivers, and so much more. So I think start to think for yourself, when choosing your project topic. I'm going to ask you those questions again. When have you had a negative emotional experience and reframed it into something positive? What mainstream industries and experiences have gaps that result in negative experiences for the communities that we know and care about? And what supply and demand sectors can be reinvented for a better experience? So think about Airbnb, Uber, and how they reinvented travel and transportation as we know it. So with that, I'm going to get into what the design thinking process actually is and how we can think about it. So I really like the double diamond visualization of the design process. And this is how we kind of think about it at UX Woman in our 7-month design MBA program. So the first half of the design process is really around designing the right thing. That means in the first week, you're choosing your project topic, you're creating the brief, and you're posing a question to the audiences and community members that you want to design for. So you're really scoping the project for yourself from both a business perspective and an inclusive design perspective. Then you're conducting both primary and secondary research. So within the first 3 weeks of the program, you're interviewing 8 to 16 users and stakeholders within your topic space, but you're also doing secondary research on mainstream brands currently today to understand the gaps in the market today and what's going on that mainstream brands are not really solving. And then we start to synthesize our ideas. So we do activities like affinity clustering, creating journey maps, user types, personas, to really hone our research insights and really think about, okay, what's one of the most urgent problems we need to solve for our community? And then we diverge. We come up with different opportunity areas. How do we come up with solutions for this one urgent problem? And as we diverge, we might come up with 10, 20, 30 different ideas. And then we start to scope down those ideas to one MVP or one minimum viable product that we present during our midterms. So, the research and business strategy portion of our curriculum is really focused on both qualitative and quantitative methods. Qualitative methods being discovery interviews, quantitative methods meaning thought experiments to really narrow down our ideation from 10 to 20 different ideas down to 3 to 5 ideas, and then having quantitative proof to showcase to stakeholders that this idea is going to have an impact at the market. And by quantitative proof, I mean really boots on the ground business metrics, impact metrics like lead generation, emails, phone numbers, sales calls, pre-orders. Not all data is made equal. In startups, we are heavily focused on impact-driven data. As we move into corporate research and design practices, we might run something like a statistically significant quantitative survey. But that's not, again, not all quant data is made equal. Even if we might have statistically significant quantitative data, it doesn't necessarily mean that that idea is going to win in the market. So, considering that not all data is made equal. And so by the time you get to midterms, you have a really thoughtful business and design pitch on what's the problem you're trying to solve, the qualitative data to back you up on that, and what's your solution, how you narrowed it down and scoped that solution, and quant data to back you up. And then we go into designing things right. So now we're spending time in Figma, really visualizing our one MVP idea. We're building a unique design system for the idea, and we're testing and reiterating on that design system. Again, just another way to visualize the design thinking process. But really, what does it feel like in reality, right? In reality, what you're really doing as a researcher and business strategist is you're taking a whole lot of uncertainty and you're really reducing that uncertainty as you go through the design process. And with qualitative and quantitative data, you're getting to a point where you're at least 70 to 80% sure that your idea is going to win in the market. And then you gain that clarity on focus on what you're actually designing and building. A lot of times, a lot of boot camps start right here, right? You'll get a boot camp with a client who will give you a client brief and tell you exactly what to design and not really give you why you're designing what you're designing. But you need to come up with that. You need to really understand how to sift through that uncertainty and think for yourself and apply the design process for yourself. And it's that elements of scoping and business strategy that can also lead you to land potentially a mid to senior level researcher or designer role, but also redefine the design process, right? We've been selling the design thinking process since the 90s. It's been what, 35 years of selling the same old. So how can the next generation of designers, how can other creatives rethink that sales pitch? We have to understand this element, that uncertainty, the fear that stakeholders have around uncertainty and how to manage that uncertainty for everyone involved, ourselves included. So again, ultimately, we need to reframe traditional perspectives as we move from problem to solution. And we need to communicate our insights in a way that reframes the problem and the solution. It's right now 4:40, and I could tell you I have way too much content, so I'm definitely going to go over. But I will be sharing a recording of this talk. I think we'll be going over by about 30 minutes, just for you to keep in mind. And it's really simply new ways of looking at the world and then talking about it. And we as other creatives have always had that different, unique perspective in comparison to the mainstream. But we also have to think about interdisciplinary ways to approach problems and solutions. So we have to consider a company's full services when we think about design thinking and the design process. We have to think about not only usability and desirability, that's only 1/3 of the design process, but we need to think about viability. Should we do this? What's the return on investment? Is there a business need for this? We need to think about feasibility. How long will it take to build? So when we think about desirability, which is just 33% of the design process, we're thinking about the user needs. Does it fill a need? Will it fit into people's lives? Can we make them want it? When we think about viability, we're thinking about, does it align with business goals? What's the return on investment? Can this be done within a budget? Feasibility is about thinking about tech constraints, operational constraints, and how long will it take to build? So this is why we talk to users, right? We talk to users to understand that, desirability component. And this is where, going back to the question that Tatiana had, we need to go beyond traditional UX research approaches and practices that we have today. And that's why trauma-informed research is an up-and-coming methodology. It's still very new. Unfortunately, not many people are getting funded or for research for it or to really advocate for it right now, which means that all of us need to advocate for it, right? Just because of the times that we live in. But going back to why we do the research that we do, there is something called, the conscious mind versus the subconscious mind. And we as researchers really like to delve into the subconscious mind to really understand the attitudes, beliefs, and instincts and emotions of our user groups. And a lot of times research is very superficial and doesn't lead to innovative products. And research is superficial when you just focus on things like focus groups, because that leads to groupthink, or when you just do competitor analyses, because then you're only as innovative as your competitors. But when you really dive deep into your user group's emotional needs, their feelings, their attitudes, their instincts, you can build something way more innovative. You have unique insights that your competitors don't have, which leads you one step or maybe even 10 steps ahead of potential competitors and mainstream markets today. So think about Rihanna and Fenty Beauty, right? To really understand that foundation was the most urgent need, right? Women feel a pressure to look presentable every day at work and at home. And studies have shown that women wear makeup maybe 4 to 5 times a week. And we also really prioritize foundation and looking clean and looking presentable. So on days that we're running late, we might just do, moisturizer and foundation, but we might miss our mascara and our lipstick and everything else. So the bare minimum, the most urgent problem we need to solve as women and, folks, non-binary folks who like to use makeup, is just to look presentable, maybe to cover some of our flaws. And then from there, Rihanna realized, okay, so the most urgent need is foundation, right? It's not lipstick, it's not mascara, it's not skin, it's not, hair care. But she really recognized what the most urgent problem was for this demographic and then solved that problem. And that kind of gets us into the laws of UX. So as we move beyond research and we've, scoped the problem and we're coming up with ways to visualize our solution, we often rely on certain UX laws that are rooted in cognitive psychology and cognitive science principles to really ground our designs before we go test them, right? They're almost like heuristics and best practices that keep us grounded on what works best for the user, even if we haven't yet tested that design. So one element of this is Jacob's Law. So users spend most of their time on other people's websites and applications rather than yours, and their mental models are formulated around existing digital patterns. And so we have to start to think about, for example, Netflix and Roku, right? Netflix was the OG streamer. They were the first to create a streaming platform. So when other companies came out, including complementary products like Roku TV, you see that they all kind of keep in line with the Netflix original design, right? All these, and media and entertainment streaming TVs or streaming services all kind of look the same. And that's thanks to Jacob's Law and because Netflix sort of set the stage for what things need to look like. But, we also need to think beyond Jacob's Law. So are there mental models from marginalized communities that then get adopted to the mainstream? One example of this is the word woke, right? Woke was originally used by a very specific community and then got adopted by the mainstream. And then it got to the point where the word woke is very polarizing, right? Politically speaking as well. So I guess my point here is, to think, beyond these mental models and see how mental models of our communities can be adopted to the mainstream, but what are the consequences of that, right? Another example of Jacob's Law is Netflix's research on indirect competitors during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, Netflix noticed that, TikTok was up and coming, and a lot of people were focusing time on consuming TikTok videos late at night, binging, rather than watching Netflix shows. And so they started to study TikTok's, interaction patterns, and they studied Spotify's interaction patterns and, even channel surfing back in 2021. And then they came up with a feature called Play Something. And Play Something was the ability to channel surf on Netflix. So you would click Play Something and you would be able to surf through a couple of different, shows and options. And they were trying to see, would that work because of these interaction patterns they were seeing at TikTok and channel surfing on TV and Spotify. Unfortunately, Play Something failed, but this was kind of us getting to see how Netflix continues to innovate and continues to optimize their service even today. So remember that you don't need to reinvent the wheel when you're thinking about design and UI UX design. Can your design be so good that it's almost invisible? So this is why I think, especially with the age of AI and, design becoming a lot more templatized, design was always templatized. We always applied Jacob's Law, even 10 years ago. And we always had like a set template of doing things because of cognitive science and cognitive principles. So I'm not afraid of AI with their templates and UX wireframes. I think it's more the strategy that's really relevant to focus on. And if you can focus on UX strategy and business strategy and all that uncertainty, navigating through all that uncertainty to come up with a solution, I don't think AI can take away your job just yet, or at least for the next 5 to 10 years. We also have Hicks' law. So the time to make a decision increases with the amount of complexity and number of choices. So again, Netflix kind of entered that paradox, right? When they first started, when they were the OG streamer, it was a big selling point to have so many different TV shows and content pieces on their platform. But then it became too much to consume, and people just were overwhelmed with looking at, where to search for all this content. So then they kind of leaned into the TikTok approach of one piece of content at a time, really considering Hick's law to really simplify what users wanted to watch. And they try to do that within their homepage recommendations page as well. Another really great example of Hick's law is Amazon's one-click buy, right? Most checkout processes are about 5 to 6 steps long. Amazon actually has a very technical process that allows them to create the one-click buy. So they've actually patented that technical process, and other companies have to license the one-click buy from Amazon, which not many companies have the money to do that. The only company that licenses the one-click buy is Apple Music with their one-click buy in their Apple Music store. So that, has led to less decision making, more efficiency in the checkout process. And of course, that boosts sales for Amazon. But I think we also have to consider that Hick's law doesn't necessarily mean that users want more convenience all the time. Yes, we want fewer options, but sometimes we want, and that doesn't, options is not, equated to convenience. So there was actually a research study done by Lego, and research at Lego showed that, their consumers actually wanted really hard Lego sets, and they wanted a challenge when it came to building Lego. So I don't think everything in UX is and should be about convenience. And I think that's where we're going wrong with AI today. So a lot of times CEOs today and corporates are pitching AI as being this tool that increases efficiency, but creativity might reduce as a result of increased efficiency, right? So sometimes you need to take more time. Sometimes you need more of a challenge. Sometimes you need to actually use human critical thinking skills, rather than having this world where we're starting to see the dark side of AI, where there's AI content overload, right? We see a lot of crappy AI content on our social media feeds, or we see, folks in the job market applying through AI and AI systems taking in those applications. So it's just AI talking to each other. And we're getting into the dark side of AI very quickly because a lot of these leaders are not thinking about the consequences of their actions and the consequences of ethical and inclusive design, which is why we have to do it. So we're starting as consumers to lose trust in the system, right? We understand that Amazon provides us with a lot of convenience. I use Amazon and I've been really, really trying hard not to use it, but it's so convenient, right? And we, as consumers, we have this love-hate relationship with a lot of these corporate brands. And we're starting to question our trust in these corporate brands and, wonder, okay, is this really the right way to do things? Or is the system just really broken? Don't trust Facebook, right? We rely on our social media and our Instagram feeds to keep us connected with our communities. At the same time, we don't want to be sold to all the time. So again, it really comes down to emotions and ethics, emotional design and ethical design. And, we are starting to see much more distrust and frustration with existing corporates and systems. But that really paves the way for startups to take root and scale. So think about Airbnb, Uber, during the start of the gig economy. Clearly, we weren't doing things well enough, right? Think about Fenty Beauty, right? Clearly, the mainstream was just not good enough, was too broken to address all needs. And so startups come up and we innovate. And with that, we're going to get into the 10-minute design MBA. So I think it's really important for everyone who's learning design to understand that UX design and research looks very different at a startup versus a consulting firm versus a large corporate. And the way UX design is practiced changes as a company grows and scales. So just to understand, okay, how do we do this? We start at something called the problem solution fit, which is something that you will go through if you are a part of the design MBA program. But that's where you're doing the discovery interviews. That's where you're utilizing blue ocean strategy to really understand what's the urgent problem to solve and what's the solution. And that's how you start to scope and come up with your MVP based on qualitative and quantitative methods. And then what we do is we keep testing our MVP. We keep trying to essentially sell our MVP until we hit something called product market fit in the business world. And product market fit means that at this point, at the MVP stage, you might have spent 80 to 90% of your time working on product and product development, and maybe 10 to 20% of your time on sales, operations, and marketing. But as you move into product market fit, it's starting to become a 50-50. You're starting to sell your product. Users are starting to adopt the product. Your marketing campaigns are successful. You might start to spend as much as 50% of your time dedicated to sales and marketing, and 50% of your time dedicating to optimizing your existing MVP, because people have already latched on to that MVP. So now you have to make that MVP better. Back when you had no users, you could make radical changes to your MVP. You could completely slash your design and completely redesign it and come up with something new. But as we gain market adoption, we have less ability to change the product, right? So our MVP is now set in stone, and now we keep improving our MVP to version 2.0, 3.0, and so on. And as we get into product market fit and we're starting to earn our first revenues as a business, we then start to think about scale, and we get into channel product fit. So initially, our marketing efforts might consist on running through one or two channels. Maybe we sell through YouTube, or maybe we sell at the grocery store, or maybe we sell through Amazon. But then we start to think, to scale, we need to sell across multiple marketing and distribution channels. So we might need to sell through YouTube, through Instagram, through LinkedIn, through Amazon, through you name it, Google. And we start to grow and scale accordingly. And so as we grow, more resources are poured into that growth and those marketing and scaling efforts until we reach maturity. Maybe we have now scaled to our entire city. If maybe we have a restaurant franchise in the city of Philadelphia, for example, or maybe we have scaled to become a national business, and our brand is known across different cities. Maybe we've scaled internationally even, and that's when we're getting into like a large corporate. And so when we're at that, problem solution fit phase, we're doing things like discovery interviews. It's really important to be able to build a product from 0 to 1, build different versions of an MVP. A lot of your MVP versions might fail as a startup, and you might have to rethink things and go back to the drawing board and keep rethinking what solution is going to make the most sense. So that 0 to 1 build approach is really crucial in the discovery phase and the problem solution fit phase. Once we get to the MVP phase, we're really thinking about simplicity in design. How can we build the simplest version of our product that is still adoptable by a large market? Tinder is a great example of an MVP. They were super simple when they came out, right? Before Tinder, we had dating apps like Match.com and OkCupid, and you essentially had to fill out this like 2-page resume to go start dating, right? But Tinder simplified that process. It was upload a couple of photos, write a sentence about who you are, and start swiping. And that simplification was really crucial for Tinder to become a really successful MVP. And we talk about Tinder as a case study in our MBA program. And then we also finally get to product market fit. So as we're earning our first revenues, we might start to do things like A/B testing and really lean into more quantitative analytical data to really see how we grow and scale. And we might start to define more user types. So at this stage, we have gone beyond our early adopter user types, and we're now starting to expand on who are some additional users or user groups who could really benefit from our solutions. So again, how might we create inclusive business principles to stand by growing and scaling our companies ethically and creatively, right? So when I went to Wharton, the whole focus on building a business was all about growth and scale. It was all about grow, 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 scale, scale, scale. But I think we're seeing with the way companies are trying to grow and scale, quite frankly, pretty unethically today. We're seeing that, growth is not always needed for the sake of growth. And especially when you're, conducting mass layoffs and still continuing to turn profits and just, growing for the sake of growing. So this is my question to you, right? There is no definition on inclusive business principles because quite frankly, there aren't as many inclusive business practitioners. We need more othered creatives running businesses, operating businesses to really develop new practices in this area. So even today, if you go to any MBA program, any business school, they're going to have, entrepreneurship is all about growth and scale and selling. And that kind of becomes ingrained into you as an entrepreneur. But we have to pause as well in the world that we live in, considering sustainability of resources as well, and think, okay, well, are we doing this right? Is this the right way to go about it? And I don't have the answer. I'm just posing the question. So with that, I will get into our last piece of the talk. We're at 5 o'clock, so I think we won't go more than like 10 minutes, hopefully, but talk about UX career paths. So there's different terminologies for how design is practiced, though there are similarities and commonalities across all these different modes of design. So design thinking is the iterative process of reframing and re-understanding user problems at a deeper level. It's interdisciplinary. If we add that layer of inclusion onto it, it means really co-creating with marginalized audiences and user groups. An example of design thinking at play is building innovative products that are a new take on how users want to do things. For example, Airbnb. Service design is the practice of improving an organization's internal practices and processes and pooling company resources to positively affect employees and indirectly their customers. So this is the type of work I did when I was in consulting, right? A lot of times consulting studios like IDEO and Frog Design, where I used to work, will work with these big name brands and we will optimize internal processes for them, optimize internal tools for them, even create internal software for them so that they can really operate more smoothly and efficiently. And customer experience design considers the end-to-end experience of the customer, both before and after conversion or purchase, right? So if you're thinking about how somebody buys a Ford car, you might think about all the research they do in the 6 months leading up to the purchase of the car. You might see them scroll on Ford car dealerships. You might see them vet multiple options and narrow down their options based on 2 or 3 different models that they like. And then finally, you might see them purchase the car, and then you might see them kind of work with dealerships and mechanics to maintain their car and learn more about their car post-purchase. That's the entire customer experience. So really understanding and exploring messaging to customers both before, during, and after they buy a product or service. UX design or product design is the process of creating products or services that satisfy user needs. So really, when we're thinking of UX design, we're really trying to understand what users want before designing the app or web platform. And it's a little different because it's not considering the end-to-end customer experience, but more focused on product. And then UI design is the process of creating those digital interfaces. So we might create app screens or app workflows to really reflect what the product is and how to visualize that product. I really like some visuals of how all these different definitions work together. So this is one of the visuals I came across. This is one of my favorites. So systems design is essentially design thinking and inclusive design and universal design or design justice. And then we get into service design. So how do we design a service? How do we optimize the business model for a business? Again, this is why business thinking is so crucial. Then we get into UX design and UI design. Another way to look at things is, the customer experience versus service versus product, UX, and then UI. So I hope you leave this session feeling empowered to act on your ideas and more knowledgeable about the UX career space in general, as well as how, your voice counts in terms of changing a very broken system. Design thinking is broken. The design process is broken. I think tech world and corporates are broken in in a lot of ways, but that's actually what excites designers, right? We love fixing broken things. We love tinkering. We love improving processes. We love redefining and rethinking things. And so there's a lot of excitement to be had in terms of fixing what's broken, I think. Or at least that's the optimistic way of looking at a system that, isn't quite perfect and never will be, right? We also have to be aware that we will never achieve perfection, even if we strive for it, but we can always do better. So I hope you leave the session with a different perspective than you started, and I hope you allow yourself to change your mindset and really rethink your ideas. I think the best practice any entrepreneur or designer can have is that ability to rethink things and constantly iterate and improve over time. And there's so much that we can improve right now. So if you're thinking about creating your own personalized UX career blueprint for yourself, I would really recommend asking yourself these three questions. What are your top three industries to work in for UX? Are you excited about solving problems in healthcare or finance or e-commerce or social media? Do you have expertise in some of these industries that can transfer over into a UX career? Can you leverage past industry expertise to become a UX expert for that industry? So again, for example, Valerie, one of our mentees, leveraged a 10 plus year career in healthcare to become a UX lead and UX manager for CVS Corporate, really leveraging her healthcare background and her UX skill set. So then start to think about what are your top two UX career paths, right? Is it UX research, product design, UI UX design, content design? Really start to focus on one or two career paths because it's impossible to apply for everything and have a very focused approach. And the more focused you can have with your UX job search, the more success you will find. So what does your ideal work environment look like? Is it remote work, hybrid, a team where there's lots of creative collaboration? Start to ask yourself about the team environment you'd like to work in as well to narrow down the scope of what you want to apply for. And then start to think about what you need to present yourself as the best candidate out there. So what are some knowledge gaps that are preventing you from landing your dream UX job? What are some mental and emotional blockers, especially as other creatives, preventing you from going after what you want? And what are some gaps in the way that you present yourself to hiring managers? And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about UX Woman. I can share some resources on our website now that we're kind of wrapping up. We didn't go too overtime. I'm glad because I was worried we had a lot of content to cover. If you're interested in the UX Design MBA program, you can look at more information here. And if you would like to book a call with me, if you're interested in our courses, you are welcome to do so. And we go through building a UX career blueprint with you. So I will ask you those questions I asked you in this call, and we'll start to talk about your background and we'll delve into your past work experience, your transferable skills, what your dream UX job would look like, or what kind of problems are you excited to tackle, and really come up with that personalized blueprint. So we're really trying to take on an inclusive design education approach, right? We want everyone to come up with unique startup ideas that really reflect who you are and what you're passionate about. And if you cannot afford our courses at the moment, that's fine as well. We have a lot of free resources at uxwoman.com. So take a look. We have a YouTube channel. I'll be sending a recording of this video, but we also run free events throughout the year. We have a Slack channel for free, a free jobs board for entry-level UX designers and researchers. We have some free UX foundational courses as well that you can take a look at, an AI design toolkit. So, feel free to browse. Are there any questions as we're wrapping up? Oh, I'm catching up on the comments now. So I hear from Sue, when I studied fashion design, I had dark skin models and I remember there was no foundation that could suit them. And that is so true. And this was way before Riri. Yes, definitely. I have a friend in college who had to custom order her makeup online. She was from Nigeria, so she had a darker skin tone. And she used to tell me how hard it was to find her perfect skin tone. And she had to like order because it had to come from a very specific brand. So it would take weeks to arrive. And so she had to be like very proactive about ordering her foundation. I see from Christina, I see a lot of commercials on YouTube of people who have sold their likeness to use in AI content. Yes, it is very unnerving. We actually have an AI product design class. So if you're interested, like if you've already taken a boot camp or you're a mid to senior level UX designer, I highly recommend checking out our 0 to 1 AI product design innovation class. And that talks about designing AI products ethically. And one of the issues is that, creating AI that is too similar to humans and all the possible consequences of that, and how to design to show that this is different. This is AI versus this is human, because we're already approaching a world where there's a lot of distrust in online content. And it's because a lot of AI products are not being designed thoughtfully or intentionally. They're just been designed for the sake of AI, right? So we need to change that. All right. I'm glad that Daniela, you're feeling more motivated and optimistic. And I hope you feel empowered to take things into your own hands. So my secret goal in all of this is that, all othered creatives should start their own businesses and side hustles, and gig work. And really, that's the best way to learn how to, incorporate business thinking into the design process and the creative process. How many business and organizations are valuing the human approach to design compared to being satisfied with using AI? That's a really great question. And I think it really just depends on the culture, right? There's a lot of, I think the less innovative companies are the ones who are like really pushing efficiency and just slashing budgets, slashing human resources. But they're not going to do successfully at the end of the day. It's going to come back to bite them. And at least that's my take on it, right? Because you're also seeing the backlash that happens when these companies start cutting their employees, and they start to rely on AI, and then the quality of their content goes down, the quality of their products and services go down. And then they're stuck in a rut and they're losing revenue. So there's also going to be a negative side to doing this, and companies are going to learn very quickly the value of people. I'm noticing that the more innovative companies continue to value people, but might ask questions on how you incorporate AI into your design process in the interview. And it's up to all of us to strike that balance of not over relying on AI, because that leads to less creative outputs. AI is just not as creative as humans can be, because AI is essentially learning on our past patterns. So AI cannot come up with anything super unique for the future, right? So how do we not over rely on AI, but have it be the starting point of our ideation? AI is a good gut check to see what's out there, but then ultimately you're the one coming up with the creativity. Awesome. Great to hear, Tiffany. Yes, I too believe that empathy will always be needed in design. Empathy was a key selling point for IDEO for the design thinking process. AI is a partner and definitely not a replacement. Really well said. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will let you go for the rest of your Sunday. And if you are interested in learning more about service design, join our next event next Sunday that does a deep dive into service design. So hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you so much.